We got one more guest here for this Christmas Eve NFL edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is Wes Reynolds, at Wes Reynolds and the number 1 on Twitter, regular contributor to VSIN, as well as the Point Spread Weekly newsletter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Good morning. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, buddy. Good to chat with you here as always. Thank you so much for some of your time. And look, before we get into the NFL, I'll do the same thing I did with Brian and start on the college football side because we've actually seen these teams. We've got a data point. We've got a frame of reference. What were some of your takeaways from week 1 of the college football season?
Yeah, some of the favorites, especially some of the bigger favorites, really weren't sharp early, and it's always kind of hard to bet against like those, especially those top 5 favorites, the Alabamas of the world, the Clemsons. Now both of those covered, but weren't necessarily sharp early, so you don't know if that was part not wanting to show much in the first game against the inferior opponent, or just maybe just plain old nerves in the first half of those games. But I think, just kind of looking across the landscape, you saw a lot of those teams not very sharp early. And then I think another thing that I noticed, at least in a few games, I don't know if it's a pattern, but a lot of these early kind of sharp or quasi-sharp moves didn't win. And, I mean, I was able to have an okay week in the first week, but I had a lot of bad calls. I mean, we saw some of these moves, like, for instance, South Florida. South Florida opened up about 13.5, went down all the way to 10.5. We're never in the game against Wisconsin. And you just saw some really bad performances, especially from teams that you would have thought that had ended the season so poorly, like for example, South Florida did, losing their last 6 games, that, hey, you want to get back out there and get that bad taste out of your mouth. Didn't happen with South Florida. Didn't happen either with Florida State. So some of these teams, the momentum of playing poor football certainly continued to start the first game of the next season.
Well, Virginia Tech, another one, too, that stood out. I mean, they moved through key numbers of 3 and 4 against Boston College. The problem was they were -4 in turnover margin. And that was one of the things that did plague some of those sharp line moves last week. Some of those games had lopsided turnover margins. I know that you're on a side here specifically in a game that we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes where they fell on the wrong side of the turnover margin, especially with the types of turnovers that they had. So, again, box score study, very, very important as you make that transition from week 1 to week 2. And you don't want to overreact to one data point, but it is interesting, because if I remember correctly, last year it felt like sharp guys in some of those week 1 and week 2 line moves, they got off to a really good start. This year, a lot of those guys didn't. So I'm kind of curious. We're going to see if that patience is displayed, if they go back to the well on some of these teams. And so far, based on what I'm seeing from those sharp moves we saw in week 1, those same sides are getting bet again here in week 2.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that's one of the things that you're going to see at least early in the season, week 2, week 3, and then maybe even on to week 4, is you're going to have to look at how these teams got beaten, if it were turnovers and looking to see maybe if they out-yarded the team, but then they're -3 or -4 in turnover margin, because usually at least that amount of a turnover margin doesn't continue into the next week. I mean, it may be -1 turnover margin, but it might not be 3 or 4. So that's kind of those are things you have to look at in terms of being able to go against these teams that maybe looked like world beaters in week 1 and were off big upsets, because I think bettors kind of look at that and say, oh, well, it was just totally priced wrong. When we become so results-oriented, I mean, if you look at something like, I'm trying to think of a good example, Missouri, Wyoming. Missouri took a lot of money from like 14 to 17. I think there may have been a little bit of buyback at the end on the underdog, and they lose outright to Wyoming. So I mean, people are going to say, oh, Missouri was priced wrong, or Wyoming was really good, and nobody projected him to be. I mean, it is one game, so you have to be willing to kind of step in front of that perception or that generalization that, well, maybe this team wasn't as good as they were supposed to be, or maybe this team's better than they were supposed to be. Usually it's going to at least go to the mean in terms of what these teams were projected to be. So it's not going to be, I mean, they're not going to be that far off. Some teams are going to be off on when you get to the end of the season and then kind of reassess everything. But for the most part, the projections, at least in terms of like win totals or something like that, are going to be fairly accurate.
Well, and for this first game here, I mean, the cart's rolling down the hill and the horse is still at the top because people already have an idea of what you're looking at here in this game. Game 319, 320, West Virginia and Missouri. This one's up from 11 to 14. There's still a straight 13.5 out there at Matchbook, the offshore exchange, which is one of the sharper outlets out there. If you want to know what the sharp sides are, Pinnacle and Matchbook are two of the places in the offshore market to look. There's a reason this game's gone up from 11 to 14, and we pretty much just talked about it there in that previous little bit.
Yeah, exactly, and Missouri's actually a side I like this week. And it's not that West Virginia necessarily struggled with James Madison. James Madison is actually number 2 in FCS, so that's a quality opponent. That's not a patsy that West Virginia beat, but one of the things I looked at with West Virginia is how they got dominated up front really most of the game on both sides. Only gained 1.4 yards per carry on the ground. Missouri, meanwhile, it was the turnovers that really cost them. They had a little bit of trouble stopping Wyoming on the ground, but Wyoming really wasn't able to throw the ball at all. So I looked at this as a little bit of a buy low, even though the number's really high. I kind of felt where they put it out was kind of telling you what the market thought of Missouri. And the fact that with West Virginia, you got a new quarterback. Granted, he was an Oklahoma transfer. First game on the road. This is a new system that they're running at West Virginia under Neil Brown. So new coordinators pretty much on both sides of the ball. So I think, that number, when you look at it on the surface, Adam, on Missouri is like, wow, that's really high. That's, almost or right at 2 touchdowns. But that's where I think you got to kind of eliminate maybe your first glance and look at it a little deeper and say, okay, why is this line at this number? And I think it's there for a reason.
Yeah, this is one I'm pretty upset that I missed. Missouri opened an 11-point favorite. My line was 14.5. Didn't wind up playing this one on Sunday as the openers were coming out. Pretty upset about missing that one because there was only one way that this line was going to go. I mean, yes, West Virginia beat James Madison by a touchdown. I believe they were outgained in that game as well. But the optics here are that West Virginia was not expected to be a good team with the transition. They lost a lot from last year. New head coach in Neil Brown. Missouri took money last week. And look, they threw a pick in the end zone. They fumbled at the 1-yard line and had a fumble basically returned for a touchdown in that game. Those were the 3 of the turnovers that they had. That's a game they should have won. Should they have covered? I don't know, maybe not, but they should have at least won the game. If they win that game, this number does open 14. So there was an initial overreaction to what happened in that one. Again, that's why, I like to do my numbers. I like to do my numbers on Friday before the games are actually played on Saturday, just so I don't fall victim to those overreactions. I missed the boat on this one. I'm upset about it. I know you got it under 14, so kudos to you for that grab. But these are important things here in the first 4 weeks of the college football season for all of our listeners to remember. Box score study, look for those misleading final scores. Those are very important things to get some line value the following week.
Yeah, and I think when obviously as we play more games, as teams get, we get in mid-October, late October, early November, the lines are going to be a lot tighter, and you're not going to see as much movement in even a more fluid college football market. you're just, once you have several games under your belt, you kind of, for the most part, there's always some outliers, but you kind of know what these teams are going forward. So that's why looking at the box score studies, and then you can't, it's impossible to watch every single game, but, just good old-fashioned kind of watching what you see and looking what you see with it in terms of energy and stuff like that matters. And you might not have gotten it in a box score. And I guess an example of that was like the Monday night Labor Day game with Notre Dame and Louisville. Yeah, Notre Dame's a better team than Louisville. And I'm still not high on Louisville long term. I know when Kirk Herbstreit was doing the analysis of the game, they break down the schedule, and he's impressed because they played them close for a while. He was saying, Louisville could win maybe 6 games or 7 games. Maybe they could, but I'm doubting it. I think, but with what you saw out of Louisville, even though they ended up losing by 18 and they covered or didn't cover, depending on your number, they had a lot more energy. They looked at least more motivated and ready to play. Last year when you watched them with this whole thing with Bobby Petrino, I thought they really quit on him. They didn't look like they had any quit in them on Monday. So you notice little things like that when you watch a game, if a team is playing with energy, if a team is playing with focus, in spite of a talent gap that may arise.
So here's a real interesting game to move down the board a little bit here. Game 325, 326, Northern Illinois and Utah. Utah's laying a big old number in this game, Wes. It's up in the 21.5, 22 range.
Yeah, and I was on Northern Illinois at plus 23, and that's just kind of what I like to do early in the season is find these games with perception. We know that the Pac-12 really, I think, by and large, disappointed last week or ended up disappointing. There were some teams that won, so it's not like the whole conference lost. But Oregon, of course, losing the way that they did to Auburn in the final seconds. USC, granted, JT Daniels got hurt, but USC was in a struggle with Fresno State. Oregon State took money, and depending on what number you had, I didn't cover against, I think it was Oklahoma State. And then UCLA looked bad on national television on Thursday night against Cincinnati. Arizona's already got a loss to Hawaii. So you're seeing that the perception of the conference, also Stanford kind of life and death to beat Northwestern, and they lost their quarterback, so maybe if they don't lose Costello, they win by 20 points. But you get the drift that a lot of these Pac-12 teams were very disappointing, but yet Utah looked really, really good in terms of forcing turnovers, in terms of the running game. They had 2 defensive touchdowns against BYU, and they really outplayed BYU, even though the yardage marks were fairly close. But when you come home and you just beat your rival, and you've now beat them 9 times in a row, and it's not like they have a look-ahead spot next week. They have Idaho State, but I just thought it was a big number, even against the Northern Illinois team with the first-year coach. He's a former player there, Thomas Hammock, but Northern Illinois seems to have kind of maintained a culture as a good program, even with various coaching changes over the year from Dave Doran to Rod Carey and now with this guy. And I just was basically taking a number in a situation there. I think Utah's clearly the best team in the Pac-12 South. Even before the season, I was like, they're the best team, but I'm not sure by how much. There's a gap in that Pac-12 South. Washington and Oregon are pretty even in the North, I think, and it'll come down to those 2 teams. But there's a big gap between the Utahs and the UCLAs, USCs, Arizona State, and that other side of the division. So the market perception on Utah is high, and it was just kind of playing at least short-term against that perception.
Well, and of course, too, you look at this game, it's a total of 43, and you've got a spread over 3 touchdowns here in this one. So your natural inclination in that type of situation should be to look at the dog. This number is moving down a little bit. Look, this is also an 11 a.m. local time kickoff. So what are the chances that Utah is, ready to go out there and blow somebody out? This start time actually makes more sense for Northern Illinois than it does for Utah. So that's kind of a consideration here as well.
Right, and that's where you could maybe look in the first half as well. Because first half lines usually aren't out early in the week. They're usually out closer to game time. But my guess would be you'd be getting around I don't have it in front of me. You'd be getting around 13.5 of the first half.
Yeah, it's true. And also, too, I mean, this is one of those games, and I sort of look at this a little bit like I did the BYU game. Northern Illinois does a lot of the same things Utah does. Utah just does them better. So in a game like that, Utah is incrementally better on each play. Does that equate to covering as a 3-touchdown favorite? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like you said, they just do them better and have a little bit better talent. But, this is a Northern Illinois team that's been a pretty good non-Power 5 program for a while. They've gone on the road and won games in the Big Ten. I mean, this is a team in the last 5 years that has gone on the road and beaten Iowa. They've gone and beaten Northwestern. So I don't think, even though it's a unique market in terms of altitude, I don't think they're going to be an intimidated group at least.
All right, so let's move down to game 353, 354 here, Wyoming and Texas State. You're not going to hear much about this game on a lot of the other shows that are out there, but of course we're going to cover it. Wyoming was 7.5. Now we're 7, pretty much market wide, varying juice as the books try to hold on to this key number, sort of massage the market around. What's the thought process here on this game, Wes?
This was another one of those perception games because I got fortunate. Unfortunately, on Twitter, I put it out at plus 33.5 and it lost. But had Texas State plus 34 at Texas A&M, with Texas A&M maybe not wanting to show much, and then of course going to Clemson now this week. And Texas State's a guy I like this new coach that they hired. He used to be on the A&M staff a couple of years ago. But Texas State didn't end up covering. They actually had to get a late touchdown to get a fortunate backdoor push for those of us that had 34. But, Wyoming pulls this big upset at over a 2-touchdown underdog, and now against an SEC team, and now they go on the road to face a Sun Belt team in San Marcos, Texas. I mean, they're not going on the road where they're going to be geared to play Texas or Texas Tech or somebody like that. They're playing Texas State. And just looking at that, I wish I would have got the 7.5. I still think it's fine at 7. But if you look at that's where you also go inside the numbers again, Adam. Gave up 537 yards and 423 of them through the air, Wyoming did, to Missouri, and mustered 389. They ran the ball pretty darn well. They got 7.1 yards a carry, but plus 3 turnover margin. I mean, they got absolutely outplayed in the stats. I mean, not enough for Missouri to cover that big number like you were saying earlier, but enough to where they probably should have lost that game. And now they go on the road to a team that it's like, well, because one of the things we've also heard where you get conference perception that can go kind of in your favor as a bettor. How much have we heard about the Mountain West this week on a lot of these betting shows and how good that they looked? I mean, Fresno State almost beat USC. Nevada upsets Purdue. Boise State goes to Florida State and wins. Of course, Hawaii in the quote-unquote week 0 matchup upsets Arizona as a double-digit dog. And, I mean, you got a lot of big wins for the Mountain West. It was really a banner week for the league. And now you've got a team going on the road laying 7 points here. So that was kind of my thoughts there.
Well, and also, too, I mean, not that it doesn't get warm in Laramie, but it's going to be 100 degrees at kickoff for this game. 101 degrees down in San Marcos. The humidity expected to rise throughout the night. It's going to reach its low point around kickoff for this one, but the humidity, as we get deeper into the game, going up a little bit. Look, obviously in Laramie, you've got the advantage of the altitude when teams come to town, but now you're going to go down to sea level, play on the surface of the sun in 100-degree weather. It's not a good spot at all for Wyoming, and also for Texas State here. I mean, look, over the last 4 years, they have 5 wins over FBS teams. I think all 5 of them our conference opponents. You don't think they want to get an FBS win over somebody else? I think Texas State's a great play this week. I really do.
Yeah, I wish I would have got 7 in the hook. And that's one thing I've got to do better. And you were talking about it earlier in the discussion, is getting these numbers a little bit early. Now we've got even more of a challenge because on Sunday we're so kind of ensconced in the NFL that these numbers are going to come out usually late Sunday afternoon. And I guess Circus Sports and our friend Matt Lindeman, they were the first to the market with these. So kudos to them for putting it out there and, putting some gamble in the line a little bit, because the easy thing to do is what some shops do and wait until Monday morning and see a market mature and then kind of copy those numbers. So, wish I would have gotten the 7.5, but I still think at a touchdown at home, this is a solid play.
Yeah, I think so too. And certainly I'll echo your props for Matt Lindeman, a good buddy of ours, and great for Circa. Not only did they put out sides first, and they did that around 3 p.m. Eastern, so a little bit around 12 p.m. Pacific. We'll see what they do here this week with, of course, the NFL going on. They also opened the totals market, and that's ballsy as hell. I mean, we know totals can be inefficient really this time of the year. That's balls, man. I give them a lot of credit for that. It's awesome to see. I'm glad somebody's advancing this industry.
Well, and I got to say, too, that's another thing I've been a little bit asleep on, because I think the totals market is where the moves are going to be. And there are some guys that really specialize in totals and play a lot more totals. I had to happen to have a good discussion with Kenny White about this, and he likes to play more totals in college. And, of course, Kenny has put a book out. I'm not getting paid for this, but I'll plug it because it's a good publication. But he's put his power ratings. He's been doing these power ratings for 30 years. And for bettors that maybe aren't sure how to make their own rating, that at least, and you can adjust it in terms of how you want. But when he puts those power ratings out now, it gives you a base, especially if, it's like, well, I know how to pick winners, or I know how to evaluate teams, and I know how to evaluate statistics, but I'm not sure how to assign a power rating to that. And I think, like Kenny's book out there really, I think, gives you a gauge on kind of how to do this, and then you can adjust it accordingly in terms of injuries or adding certain factors in, like weather, where you don't want to just go on raw numbers and raw power ratings, but you can adjust them accordingly based on situations and whatnot. And it's a useful tool, especially whether you're an inexperienced bettor, you've been doing this a while like I have. I mean, it really helps you out as a tool, and you learn more by doing that.
One more college game I want to talk about, and I haven't had a chance to check out Kenny White's guide. I do my set of power ratings over at BangTheBook.com. I know they're not nearly as good as his, but again, that was my goal, was to help educate people how to do it themselves. And I've gotten some really positive feedback from that. And I'll definitely make sure I check out Kenny's magazine next year when it comes out over the summer. But one more game I want to tackle here with you, Wes. 371-372, Tulane and Auburn. And this is kind of a fun one. Auburn, maybe a wrong side winner against Oregon, had that fourth quarter comeback where Bo Nix actually looked like the player that he was recruited to be. Tulane, wire-to-wire dominant performance over FIU. I'm on FIU this week. Maybe I'm burning money once again. I was on FIU last week, but, man, in terms of teams that looked really good in week one, Tulane was one of them.
Yeah, and this is something where I'm going to learn something, win or lose, because one of the things sometimes that we do, Adam, when we like a season win total, we tend to kind of stick to our guns and maybe bet them week to week. And sometimes that can prove to be a mistake. That'll be something here that I will notice with Tulane, because Tulane was a team that I really liked over their season win total. And I really like this coach, Willie Fritz, who was previously at Georgia Southern. He was at Sam Houston State. He was at Central Missouri. So this is a guy that worked his way up from the lower levels to, I know Tulane is not a Power 5, but you could tell he's worked his way up, and they've gotten better every year under him. He's now in his fourth year. They were 4-8 the first year, and then 5-7, and then 7-6. Made a bowl game and got a bowl win. this is a guy that I think has improved this program every single year. And they run this, they run a little variation. It's not a true triple option. It's a little bit more of a spread option that they've got some little different nuances, and they can throw the football a little bit more out of it. But he ran a little variation of this at Georgia Southern, who we know is one of the few triple option teams in the country, dating back to Paul Johnson. And he's got a senior quarterback who, when he took over the team last year, that team really started winning games and won, I think, 4 of their last 5, and then plus the bowl game. And that's Justin McMillan, who is a graduate transfer from LSU. Wasn't a 5-star kid, but a quality quarterback. And I just think, this is a team that you get one of these teams like this that's in a non-Power 5 that maybe a lot of these kids were either transfers from SEC programs or kids that wanted to play in the SEC. Now they get a shot at a team like Auburn, who's off that heroic late win. That was actually a fortunate win for me. Bad beats were kind of the theme of week 1. I did take Auburn money line at minus about 160 and thought, well, I don't really have a chance. And they end up getting the touchdown and getting the cover instead of just kind of playing it close to the vest and kicking the field goal. But yeah, I think this number is a bit high. I was expecting maybe 16.5 or 17. So not a huge difference, but yeah, I do like this Tulane team. And then you've got this Auburn team that's got to be patted on the back all week long about how good they are, and you went and beat Oregon, and maybe you can be up there with the Alabamas and the LSUs in the SEC West. And I just think that this is a good spot to go with a dog that's very hungry and very underrated in the marketplace.
Well, and also, too, you have to wonder, Auburn has a big talent advantage here. There's no question about that, but how much emphasis do they put on this game to prep that defense for this, gimmick offense that Tulane has? And I don't mean gimmick in a negative connotation. I mean just something different that Auburn's not going to see. They've got bigger fish to fry in the SEC. Now they're a legitimate college football playoff contender off that win against Oregon. They've got bigger things to worry about. So how much do they put into this game against Tulane, I think, is a very fair question. And that's something you have to consider in all these non-conference games.
That's an interesting point, too, because now they only have that traditional short week or that 1 week to prep. It wasn't like and this is one where I underestimated last week because LSU, of course, opened with Georgia Southern, who's a triple option offense. I'm like, well, how much prep did they put in for Georgia Southern? Well, they evidently put in a lot because they absolutely crushed this team, and there are a lot of other smarter people than I that were also on Georgia Southern and almost 4 touchdowns, and they were never even close. So LSU did have 2 weeks or plus of August practices to at least get a look at this Georgia Southern. And when you only have 1 week, it makes it for tougher prep. So that's a good point by you.
All right, so let's transition to the NFL here for just a couple of minutes to finish up the segment, Wes. And I think first and foremost, what I want to pick your brain about here is what's different about betting the NFL as opposed to college football in your mind?
Yeah, one of the things you want to look at, and one of the things I don't think that bettors do look at enough in the NFL, is when you're trying to assess why a number is where it is, or why it gets put to where it is, or bet to where it is, or what have you. In the NFL, you got a lot more teaser exposure with these bookmakers, and they know which lines and they know which team's going in. I mean, you don't have to be somebody like Jimmy Vaccaro, who's done this 50 years or whatever, to know on Sunday, okay, this is what we're going to have for our teasers. So I'll try to give a couple examples here just really quickly. If you look at something like the Rams in Carolina, now, from a point spread perspective, I want to take 3. I don't know if I'm going to get it, but it's 2.5. And look, people are going to lay the short favorite with a team that made the Super Bowl last year, being the Rams, even though Super Bowl losers in week 1 against the spread are 2-12-1 the last 15 years. They're going to want to lay the Rams. So if you're seeing this at like 2.5, they're comfortable with it because they think maybe we can reduce a little bit of that exposure if we get sharp guys that are going to be willing to tease that up through the 3 and the 7 and take the Rams at 8, 8.5, or the Carolina side at 8, 8.5, or 9. So that's a thing to look at, as well as you look at some of these favorites like Baltimore, Miami. Baltimore is going to be in probably every teaser in the country, or almost every teaser that's being played. So does that mean you want to immediately go bet Miami? Not necessarily. They're going to be probably one of the real dregs of the league. So taking teasers, I think, into account sometimes will give you clues. And then one of the things I got to do today and tomorrow or the next day is submit Super Contest and Circa Million picks. A lot of these contests are going to make it really hard on you if you're in those contests where, like, let's say the Chargers and the Colts, for example. Even though market-wide it's 6.5, even if there were 7s out there, I know that the Westgate or Circa is probably going to put Colts plus 6.5. They're not going to give you the 7 because they're going to make it a challenging for you where you've got to debate back and forth like, well, I like the side, but do I want to take 6.5 because I'm not getting the key number? And that's what makes it a challenge in these contests, not to mention the amount of people in it in terms of being able to, whether you want to win it or just getting the money. So you're going to have a lot of those games that are kind of around those key numbers where you may have to kind of hold your nose and say, well, I'm not getting 3, but you still got to take a 2.5. Or I'm not getting 7, I still got to take a 6.5. So that's really, I think, the challenges in the NFL, just being around these key numbers so much, and the fact that the numbers move a lot less than the college football market.
Yeah, when you look at the NFL, you've got 2 games in double digits here this week, and the one game is only a 10 at Pinnacle in the offshore market with Cincinnati. Well, they don't have A.J. Green. The other one is Washington and Philadelphia. Washington has no offensive line to speak of, no Jordan Reed. Everyone's just really sour on that team. In college football, you've got 40 games a week that have double-digit spreads to them. So that's definitely one of the big differences. It's interesting you mentioned the contest thing, too, because I've been looking at these numbers and going through these thoughts in my head. Like, I'm scared that they put a 2.5 on Buffalo because I do like the Bills this week. Obviously, 3 is gone on Carolina. You're going to get 6.5 on Indianapolis. You're not going to get 7.5 on the Giants. You're going to get 7. So
right.
That's one of the things that's challenging about these contests, and I agree with you that that they do put them out there for a reason, and they should. It should be difficult, but that's one of the things that's a problem for me here is I like a bunch of teams this week hovering around key numbers, and if I want to take them, I'm going to have to take the worst of it.
Yeah, and I will be interested because obviously we have not seen a Circa contest yet. I'm guessing they may approach it the same way. They've got some former Westgate Superbook USA employees over there in part of the leadership there. But noticing, and you've noticed this too, playing the Super Contest over the years, they'll put they'll do that for a challenge, but those guys will put their opinion in the Super Contest lines too, in terms of what they're leaning towards a little bit. So I don't think this is just, okay, we're going to copy the market and see what it is. If these guys are leaning a little bit more on the underdog, they'll put it in the line in terms of the price for the Super Contest because they know that they may get some bets on both sides. They're still going to have maybe some sharper, quasi-sharp guys taking the Colts at 6.5, and then they're going to have enough people to offset that where it's like, oh, they're laying less than a touchdown. Okay, and then they'll go and bet the Chargers. So, that's what they do a lot with those contests. And, I don't know if it's a deliberate or there's malfeasance there to kind of trick you as a contest player or a bettor, but I do think that they want to make it a little bit challenging, and it's like, how strong do you like this side if you're not getting the key number? So that'll be an interesting thing that I think to work through for us that are playing these contests.
Before I let you go, I know that you listed some of those college games on your Twitter timeline, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned them, so we can get some strong opinions on the show. But before I let you go, anything you do like here for Week 1 in the NFL?
There's a couple games I do like. I'm going to be probably on more divisional dogs than I would normally be, and I'm not a real big trend player, as you know, Adam, but 17-4 against the spread the last 5 years are divisional dogs in week 1, and you've got a fair amount of them here. I will likely be on the Giants, especially you may be able to get 7.5 in the market, maybe not in the contest, but obviously with Zeke Elliott re-signing this morning. So you're going to get that accounted for into the line. Now, I don't exactly think he's in quote-unquote game shape, and judging by the pictures I've seen, but that is something I will look at. I do like the Steelers. Even only getting 5.5. There may be a couple 6s out there, just kind of looking around. But Steelers are one I like. I will be on the Colts. I think this is a good motivational spot. They're playing against a team that has probably one of the worst or lack of home field advantages in the league, that's got a little bit of offensive line issues in the Chargers. So I will be on that. And I mentioned a couple earlier, Carolina. Also like the Jacksonville Jaguars, you still might be able to find 4. I think you've got a fair amount, and even more than I thought this week, in these cliched pros versus Joe spots. And I think Kansas City, Jacksonville, Carolina, and the Rams are definitely 2 of those.
Wes Reynolds is where you can find on VSIN, also part of the Point Spread Weekly newsletter over there at Wes Reynolds and the number 1 on Twitter. Wes, appreciate your time as always, man. Thanks for hanging out a little bit longer with us here today, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right, brother. Good luck this week. Thanks for having me on.